Ms. Burney and Mr. Kilburn are absent, and the rest are present. And is the agenda going to hold up?
Yep, there's no changes.
Okay, and then we have one public comment for items not on the agenda. Mr. Sheridan, you're up.
Thank you, Chair and members. Just recently, I went to a neighborhood meeting, and your staff was there from Public Works, a Dale Escobar and a Bradley right here, and they were great. They're good at their jobs, but they informed us that there's 2,000, approximately 5,000 laterals in the city. And I don't know if you're aware, but you've been very aggressive on getting our laterals up to modern standards, less leaks. But I really have a problem when they come to a meeting and they represent that here's the state-of-the-art technology. Here's what the homeowner should be using. But, by the way, it's not available in Santa Barbara. And meanwhile, I think there's been 7 Y replacements on my block, very disruptive. Castillo Street, if you go down it now, the new improved street has additional boreholes in it due to the Y replacements. And then getting educated a little further, I understand that the city does not allow the contractor to even touch the city's sewer lateral or main sewer line. They have to call in an additional lash construction, I think it is, for about $1,000. So as a homeowner, I'm now hiring a plumbing company to dig a hole and then having the city's contractor come in. And so there's just a real disconnect on your program. I support it, but I don't think it's ready for prime time if you're going to be trying to handle 2,500. I like the idea that they've added an exemption concept to homeowners that just can't come up with $10,000 in a matter of weeks, really. So there's some problems with the program that I think they're working on the edges of the idea of a neighborhood contracting and doing there are 7 in a row right in my neighborhood where they get a bulk price. So we need some kind of relief from the program. I like the ideas of the lateral, but we really have a disconnect on the why, no pun intended. On the why part of that, I know my position is why, as a homeowner, am I in charge for something 20 feet out in the street, 11 feet underground? And I think there's a better way it could be done that's more organized, better for our streets. Now, every night we hear the cars go by, bump, 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 due to all the holes that have been added to our street. Thank you.
Well, I'll just let you know, too, that there's ongoing chatting going on both here and with staff on that SLIP program. So you are what I don't doubt that what you're describing is accurate, but I can tell you you're not in a vacuum. There's people talking about it and concerned and are looking at working with everything that you're talking about.
I appreciate that. I recognize that. I like the idea that they're going out to the neighborhoods and kind of explaining the program, but to come and give a dog and pony show for a product that's not available is a little disingenuous.
Agreed. I think Joshua.
Mr. Sheridan, Joshua Hagmark, I'm the Water Resource Manager. We actually would like to continue a discussion with you. Our acting wastewater manager, Galen Fair, is here. So
Okay.
Can we get your contact information? And we'd like to follow up with you and talk more, because we are working to develop. There's multiple fronts. There is no single thing that we need to do here to resolve this, but we would really appreciate your feedback.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and no further public comment. I don't see anybody rushing up, so we'll move on to the consent items. And let's just barrel through these, I think. The meeting minutes approval of November 15th. Any changes to those? Okay, I'd entertain a motion.
Actually, why don't you go through them all?
Do you want to do them all at once? I love, like, real consent items. Okay, so the USGS surface water and groundwater monitoring contract, any questions or comments on that? Water and wastewater standard equipment list, anything? Increase in construction change order for El Solito, anything?
I have a different agenda. I guess I have to
That's what happened. Do you want me to pause? No. Okay, thank you. And then the contract for the Gibraltar Reservoir Diversion Meter Project. Anything there? Okay.
Motion to approve consent calendar.
Second?
Okay, all those in favor? Aye. Okay, any opposed? Nobody else here? That'll work. And then we'll move on to our first discussion item, which is the wastewater rate policy discussion. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, Commissioners, Councilmember Sneddon, Malcolm Hamilton, Administrative Analyst in the Water Resources Division. I'm here today with Sean Korn from HDR, our rate consultant. If you remember in your packets, we had a memo outlining some of these key policy issues that we're going to be looking for input on today, and I'll just briefly recap, and Sean will get into much more detail in his presentation. One of which is we're going to be looking at the revenue requirement, what we need in total revenues for operations, maintenance, debt service, capital. A big thing we're looking at here, if you remember a couple months ago, you were presented or potentially know that the El Estero facility master plan has been a huge effort to identify capital projects at El Estero. It's something we got to take into account for, and we'll be looking at. The other aspect is looking at our rate structure, our fixed and volumetric charges, and how that impacts our customers. We're going to be reviewing the customer classes as well, so our residential and customer classes, and Mr. Kern will get into each of those individually. And then discussing some of the waste strength-driven policy input that we'd be looking for is our commercial classes. Right now, we have 3 classes that share the same rate, but potentially should be divided up into low, medium, high strength. We have an industrial high-strength class, and looking at what that would entail. And also looking at and reviewing the septic and portable restroom hauling rate. As we get into that, they currently pay a high-strength rate, but this analysis may affirm that that's the correct rate, or it may suggest other changes. So with that, as a quick and brief recap, I'll turn it over to Mr. Korn.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. Good to see you all this morning. As Malcolm said, we've got an update on the rate study. And so if I can get my slides to change. What am I doing wrong here? Sorry. It's moving, but it won't go to the next slide. There we go. Thank you. So what I want to do today, as Malcolm outlined some of the key policy discussions that we'll talk about, we'll provide an update on the status of the study, where we're at. I've got a quick slide on that, what we've been doing, what we've been working on. We'll talk about the preliminary revenue requirement analysis. So as this refers to the overall revenue needs of the utility as a whole. So what are those changes possibly looking like as we go forward, gain some feedback from you all on some of the key policy issues as we get into the cost of service and rate design discussion, because that's really the part where we're at today, and take a look at what that needs to be going forward. So if you remember, I presented this last time I was here, our 3-step process. We have our revenue requirement, determines the overall revenue needs, that looks at the O&M and the capital funding needs over the next 5-year period. We're actually looking out longer for the rate study, the actual model, but we're focusing on this initial 5-year period to look at what revenues need to be. We then take those costs and we proportionally and equitably allocate them between the different customer types. And so that's why we're talking customer groups today as well. because we need to have those defined so that we can allocate those costs to them so that it reflects the benefit that's received. And then we design rates based on the overall revenue needs of the system and the individual allocation of those revenue requirements to each customer class. So we have preliminary results today of the revenue requirement. So what does the pie look like? How big is that? The splitting up of the pie, that proportional allocation, we're in process. We've got a very good cut of what that's going to look like, but these policy decisions that we'll talk about today will help us refine that and finalize that so that we're able to come back with our recommendations on the cost of service and then ultimately any preliminary rate designs or structures that we'll look at as we go through this process. So I'll start out with our outcomes these aren't all of them, but the goals and objectives of the study. Really, we want to make sure that we're coming back and the revenues are sufficient to maintain the existing wastewater facility. So again, that's both on an annual O&M, operation and maintenance expense component, as well as the capital needs. And that's one reason why we're looking out over a multi-year period so that we can make sure there's no bumps in year 6 that we're not accounting for in years 1 through 5. Ultimately, we need to come back to meet the requirements of Proposition 218. We have to have that proportional and equitable approach to establishing our cost-based rates. And so again, that comes back to what do those customer groups or rate schedules look like. And as we go through this, specifically on the revenue requirement process, we want to make sure that we're taking into consideration prudent financial planning criteria. It's a multi-million-dollar business that we're looking at, and we need to operate it as a business to make sure that we're maintaining the infrastructure that you have so that you can continue to provide a high level of service to all of your customers throughout the city. And then ultimately that analysis is based on generally accepted approaches or methodologies. There is a manual. It's the Water Environment Federation Manual Practice number 27, and that outlines the approach. So what we do as we go through this process is we take that industry standard approach, but that's tailored to the city's specific customer classes, operations, capital plan, how the system is maintained and operated so that we get that proportional and equitable allocation of costs. So to go into the revenue requirement, that first step of the process, as I've said, we're looking at a 10-year with a focus on the next 3 to 5 years. Again, that's to make sure that we capture all those costs, specifically the capital plan that you were previously presented, so that we're able to look at what those funding needs are as we go out into the future. And a key aspect of this study is really coming back and looking at the current revenues. So based on our current customer data, number of customers, the rate structure or how we bill them, and this primarily gets into water consumption, how does that impact our revenues? So we've looked back and looked at water consumption. We've come back to a historical approach to develop those projections going forward. So we take that wastewater, current rate for wastewater, multiply it through by the customers and number of units billed on the wastewater side. And that puts us at our starting point for an analysis. And this is a really critical step so that everything flows together as we go through the process.
Do you want questions as we go, or do you want to make?
Absolutely.
Again, I'd like to understand a little bit better as to your basis for the water projections, given what we've just come through.
So where we're at right now is we came back to essentially this last 18-month period. Essentially, we're kind of that it's come up a little bit, right, from where we were several years ago. And so we're trying to keep it at about that level. We're not projecting this huge rebound or not expecting this huge rebound. The city has certain conservation goals and targets in place on the water side of it. And so our approach to this was taking what we've seen in the recent year, assuming that's about, I'll call it normal, and that's what we're projecting off of going forward to try and maintain that in the future. I think you will, I don't think we'll see, hopefully, huge drastic reductions again, but that's what we want to make sure we account for, because that's part of the discussion in this is where we've been the last few years. The drought did impact wastewater revenues as well as water revenues. So once we've got the revenue profile, then we come back and look at the O&M expenses. This was based on the adopted budget, and then we project that out into the future over the time period we're looking at based on historical inflationary factors. So we're taking a look at how costs have increased for the city's wastewater utility and projecting those costs going forward. As we've done that, we make sure that we meet our financial criteria, target debt service coverage ratio. That's a big one. We want to make sure that we've maintained that with the existing debt and planned future debt. We want to make sure that we're meeting the city's policy on minimum reserve levels. So we want to make sure that we're maintaining those for the wastewater utility, and that you're prudently funding renewal and replacement. As I talked about in the prior presentation, this is the change in the oil, painting the house, doing those things that you need to do every year to maintain your levels of service to your customers as we go through this. And that's part of that capital funding plan. When we look at that plan, we say, what should you be funding each year through rates? And so that's that renewal and replacement piece. So we took that capital plan that you all have seen, and we've put together a funding approach. We're working with city staff and said, here's what's going to be funded through rates. And you'll see, and what happens is it's essentially a straight line with a slight increase in it. So we're trying to fund a little bit more through rates each year to maintain the system. Whatever is not being funded through rates has to come from other sources. So when we look at the wastewater treatment plant improvements, that's planned for long-term borrowing through SRF, State Revolving Fund. So we'll have debt come back on that on an annual basis as we go forward. And then a little sliver of that is funded through existing reserves. And so that piece of it we're working on. That's finalizing that, making sure reserves are where we need to be as part of this process, and making sure that funding plan meets the future needs.
Do costs for debt service go up or down when the economy is bad? Or do they
Costs for
change at all?
debt.
So like, do SRF rates change depending upon what the state's doing in terms of economy?
Mr. Chair, no, those rates are locked in at the installment agreement rate. So, for instance, if it's 1.8 or 2%, then that would be the rate.
Raise that. So 5 years from now, if we're back to a 1988 depression, are those rates the same being offered as the state as they are right now?
From what I've seen in the last 20 years, the highest was in the SRF rate was about 2.5% in the mid-90s, and it's consistently decreased to about 1.7 right now. So it seems to be slightly independent of the financial ups
So
and
how do you
downs.
figure that rate 5 years from now?
So we have a plan right now for the plant upgrades, and so that is kind of set as an estimate at this point in time. And so that piece of this puzzle is kind of already developed as part of that project going forward.
Project what an SRF loan percentage will be, and do you increase that? Do you decrease that? Do you keep it the same as it is now? What do you do?
Generally, I would say we want to be conservative. So when we're projecting, we would project a little bit higher as part of that. Yes.
Thanks.
And part of the reason for that is we're adopting a maximum rate. And so as we're looking at multi-year projections, we want to make sure that we're not under projecting that, and all of a sudden you get to year 4 and go, we don't have coverage, or we can't make our annual debt service payment.
Thanks.
So, Mr. Chair, just an example, the electrical project will be debt funding to SRF, and we will know the rate probably in less than a year. We'll lock into that, and as Mr. Hamilton said, it doesn't change wildly, so we have some pretty good confidence. However, that project won't be done for 4 years or more, so, but that rate will stay consistent.
I guess the reason I ask that is I just read stuff that says we're ready for another economic
Yes.
downturn, and if the state runs through an economic downturn, I'm assuming you're looking at what that would be and buffering what our costs would be if we went into a downturn also.
Yep.
Okay. Kristen?
Maybe this is a question for staff, but for 10-year revenue requirement, are we assuming that we're not putting into the rate study sea level rise funding or expectations on that?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Sneddon, you're correct. We do not put in any additional costs for that, and I think as the subcommittee on sea level rise has been working through those issues, I think the next item of work will be to do a strategic plan and to develop some estimations of that. Certainly as we do projects such as the electrical project, we will be building in elements to address the current standards for flooding and sea level rise that are out there, but I don't believe they speak to the 60 and 100-year projections that the committee is working on.
I have one more kind of on that vein too. If somebody at the state actually got off and started working again on potable reuse, direct potable reuse, does that come under wastewater or under water? for budget considerations.
Mr. Chair, that's a water expense.
So it would be water, even though it would be originating out of wastewater.
That's correct.
Okay, thanks.
So we take each of these components, the revenue, the O&M, the capital funding, making sure that we're meeting our financial metrics, and we can develop the summary of the revenue requirement. And so this chart shows for each year what this looks like for the next 5 years. So our first year is fiscal year 18-19. So that's the current time period. That's that adopted budget. And then we build on that with our projections going out into the future. So I'll start with the bars going vertically. And so you'll see different colors there. The first section of those bars, the lighter blue, is the annual O&M expense. We add to that our rate-funded capital. That's the renewal and replacement. That's that darker color, the black or the dark blue. And then we have our net debt service in the green above that. And then you can see small slivers of red in the tops of some of those years. What that is taking revenues and placing it into reserves to meet either current or future needs, either to maintain target minimum balances or to put revenues away for the following year. So as we go across, if you look at the bottom part of those bars, you'll see with the lighter blue, then that is our O&M. So that's going up based on inflationary measures. Our darker color in the middle, that blacker color, that's our rate-funded capital. That is increasing slightly each year. So that's just going out to meet our renewal and replacement needs. And then you'll see our debt changes starting in 2020. That's where we start incurring some interest expense on the planned electrical upgrades. And so you'll see that green section gets bigger as we go out over time. The horizontal dashed line are our current revenues. So that's based on our current rates, our current customers, plus some growth each year, but no revenue or rate adjustments included in that process. And so you see it's fairly flat. It actually looks like it declines just because as the bars move up, it changes that perception, but it's essentially flat with a slight increase to it. The solid line that goes up at an angle is the revenue needs going out over each of those years. So starting in 2020, we have a slight deficiency. We have some interest expense kicking in, and then you can see that green section gets larger and larger. So we've built into this several components. The first piece is annual inflationary measures. Then we have our renewal and replacement funding, which goes up slightly. And then we have the additional debt service. And one thing I want to mention, and this is the reason why we're looking multiple years, year 6 is theoretically when the full debt service, both principal and interest, come into play for the electrical project at the plant. And so we've tried to build this so that we're meeting those needs in year 6, so that when we get to year 6, all of a sudden it doesn't look really bad and we're upside down again. And so to meet those needs, that revenue change, again, this is not rates. These are not the bill impacts your customers may or may not see, but those revenue impacts are roughly around 5% a year. And so what we're doing is funding annual inflationary impacts, so just changes in cost of services, chemicals, electricity, all those things that we know go up each year, as well as the increased debt on the capital side. And then you'll see the slivers in red in 23 and 24, fiscal years 23 and 24. That's putting some money into reserves because our debt service essentially jumps up or more than doubles in year 6 and fiscal year 25 when we get our principal and interest. So in order to smooth this plan over a multi-year period, then we're able to use those reserves in that final year to keep rates down over the long term so that we're not having any huge increases or spikes in the rates. So overall, we're looking at roughly the 5% adjustment in revenues over the next annually for the next 5 years to fund the inflationary O&M and annual expenses as well as the capital component of rates. I'll stop here and see if there's any, or go ahead, Joshua.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, communicating this is I think part of the challenge here, and it was one of the things that we had been discussing is if you were to do nothing and just wanted to do the status quo, you'd be looking at probably a 2.5% increase every year just to keep up with inflation, cost of living, everything kind of going up. So really talking about here is about a 2.5% increase to maintain the capital program that we are currently putting forward. It kind of helps break down that 5% and help explain what the proportions to it are. So at this point, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have about that.
Just a quick question. What's the lifespan of the project that we were funding here, the electrical program?
Well, that's a good question. I'd say it's probably a 30-year project lifespan of it, just based on we got a little more mileage out of the last electrical project than that, but that's probably because we've gone way past where we should have with the last electrical, just making it work.
That service period from 2025,
20 years.
20 years?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I just want to make sure I understand those little red guys up on the top of 23 and 24. So that is the use of reserves, or
It's
the
putting
amount you're going to charge to replenish reserves?
the latter, the amount that we're going to put back into the reserve fund to
So
use
that's-
in the next
that's rate
year.
you're going to charge to replenish the reserves.
Yes.
And in 2024, it's like $1 million, right? Give or take, probably. And then what does that do in those 2 years to the reserves, or is that 100% replenishment to both of those years' reserve categories?
So it's two pieces. It's maintaining our reserve policies, and this is part of what we're working on right now, is making sure that we've got all the correct reserves and targets and plan going out. So this is a little bit of a work in progress. But right now what this is doing is maintaining reserves at the target levels. In those last 2 years, part of that is also above the target to smooth the impact when we get the full principal payment in year 25.
Okay, but it'd be safe to say that that represents a no reduction in the target reserves in those 5-year time periods.
That would be a correct statement.
Thanks.
Just a question. So what is the target reserve? You know, how much is that out of the total, like, operating budget? What's the size of the reserve?
So the target is somewhere around $9 to $10 million. And now I can't remember what our total O&M is, 15. So we're about,
2/3.
Two-thirds, yep. And I usually think of it in days of O&M. And so, that's a good spot to be. And that's total reserves. That's all the different funds that you have.
And then the expectation after 2025 will be a little bit higher because we're getting, and then what's the expectation, that we continue to grow at that rate, or are we going to kind of flatten out to the 2.5%?
We're still working on that.
working on it.
Yes. So as we refine the reserve component and the capital planning as we go out, what that funding is going to look like, then that'll kind of drive those out years as we go through that. Theoretically, once we get to that debt service level, the full principal and interest, then it's out, ignoring any future projects that may need to happen in addition to where we are today, it would flatten out at an inflationary level or something slightly higher. So the overall revenue requirement shows that rate adjustments revenue adjustments are necessary as part of this, and really it's those three pieces we've talked about: the capital funding component, then the annual debt service component, and inflationary component that we're looking at to maintain the system revenue needs. It maintains our minimum reserves and our coverage ratios, two very important components as you're looking at funding long-term projects with long-term debt as part of that, and we maintain a financially healthy and sustainable utility. And again, that's really why we're looking out over a multi-year period to fund that.
Just a question in messaging. Fund necessary annual capital improvements and fund additional annual debt service. Aren't those really one and the same?
Yeah, so I probably could have worded that better. The first bullet is really that renewal and replacement component. So it's the, replacing the existing lines. It's doing all the things you need to do.
I'm just looking in terms of public.
Yes.
When you go back out to the public, so I'd think about that.
Yep. Thank you. Absolutely. So once we know what the size of that pie looks like, we can start allocating that. This is really where we have some more policy discussion. I'll hit on these three components: the customer classes, and then specific programs and costs as part of that. Customer classes, again, are important to cost of service because of the proportionality. We need to define what those customer classes look like. And as part of that, as Malcolm talked about, evaluating that current industrial rate for septic haulers to make sure that that is the correct rate as we go forward. As we've talked about, we have several different classes, single family, and then we have multifamily, which is split into 1 to 4 dwelling units and 5+ dwelling units. And then we have our commercial classes. We have commercial 1, 2, and 3. Those categories are set up, but they're all charged the same rate. And so as we're going through this process, we're doing some additional analysis on what customers fall in which group to see if those make sense, or can we smush those together into one rate. Or as Malcolm talked about as we started this off or are there customers in that commercial 2 or commercial 3 that are really kind of a medium strength? And that's really what it's coming back to look at is what are the strengths of those customers? Are they more like residential customers, or are they more closely related to the industrial or the commercial 4 where we see the higher strengths? So that's a piece that we're evaluating right now to come back to you all with our final recommendation. Either it's one rate or we'll have a low, medium, high type of approach rather than the 1, 2, 3, and then the 4, which is our industrial commercial class as part of that. The septic hauler rate, this is usually a separate rate for these types of customers, and so we're evaluating this rate to affirm or support changes to that rate. Currently, these customers are charged the industrial rate based on the amount that they dump into the system as part of this process, and so we're looking at that waste strength and the volume. And that's really what drives this is you get these loadings at the plant all at once, and should that rate be different than what it is today as part of that? And so this is one of the pieces that we're evaluating to determine if that is the correct approach at this point in time.
Just how much of the total load is septic? I mean, how significant is that?
It's not a huge amount in the big scheme
picture,
of
yeah.
things. Mm-hmm. The challenge with it is it all comes at once, and it's generally speaking very high strength or higher strength, and that's the challenge. Is it all comes in at once at that level, and that's what we're looking at to evaluate if that industrial rate is the appropriate rate or not as part of that. Other programs and costs, a couple of the other pieces that we're looking at, we're coming back to look at, and you'll hear more about this on the next item, is the fat, oil, and grease or FOG program. So as we're going through the study, one of the items that we'll look at is to determine are those current program rates, fees, those charges for that reflect the actual costs, because that will be pulled out of the rates and could be put in that program, and those charges could reflect those costs. So we're working on that right now as well to see if we can identify, make sure we understand what those costs are and how that plays into the overall rate and fee program for the wastewater utility. The challenges, some of them are, everybody has FOG, but it's what are those significant FOG dischargers and how does that impact the overall cost, collection system, treatment plant, et cetera, as we go through this process. As well as the pre-treatment program, we're looking at those costs as well to make sure that those current program costs are funded appropriately as part of this process. Looking at who benefits from those as you identify those pre-treatment customers, what are the costs associated with that? Are those fees and charges reflective of that? And then one of the pieces that essentially falls out of the rate study is high strength charges. So this can go along with a FOG or pre-treatment program. When we come down to the bottom of the cost of service, we'll have unit costs or dollars per pound of BOD, our biochemical oxygen demand, or suspended solids, or whatever those constituents are. And if you have customers that you're monitoring or have issues with high strength, then this is a method that you can use to charge them for those higher strengths. So we're talking about that process and how that would fit in as well. So our cost of service analysis is a work in progress. It may show cost differences. That's why when I talk about the overall revenue increases, that may not be the customer bill impacts or changes in rates for specific customers. And we'll come back to those proportionality and equity discussions as we go through this. Leading into that is our rate design, where we need to come back to collect what we have on our revenue requirement and cost of service allocation. This is where we have some more policy discussion. When you look at your costs, they're primarily fixed, especially on the wastewater side versus the water side. And so, 80 to 95% of those costs are fixed in the short term. Right now, we collect 50% of our revenues from the fixed side of the equation. And so as we go through this, we're looking at that. Part of this is the drought impact because our variable revenues have come down a little bit over time. You're at that 50-50 split roughly. At this point in time, I'm looking at maintaining that. You're in a good spot, I think, from a structure. There are a lot of utilities in California that charge a flat fixed rate for residential customers, whether they're single family or multifamily. I think your rates are more equitable at this point in time because you do have that volume component built into that. And so we're not proposing, unless we hear otherwise from the commission or city council, if there should be any changes to that ratio.
My only question is, I thought I had heard staff earlier, a year or two ago, talking about trying to increase the fixed rate. Josh, is that changed at all?
We had talked about that because of the lost revenue because of the drought, and it certainly was something that we've had Mr. Korn looking at and bringing his experience to the table as to what are the trade-offs with moving to an entirely fixed amount, and so
Or an increased amount of fixed rate.
right, and it does. It comes with trade-offs. Having a fixed amount lowers costs for higher users and increases costs for lower users of water. And so it shifts costs around pretty dramatically. And I think with where the recommendations are going, I think it is likely we'll stick with something similar to what we have, but it'll be more equitable.
Great,
Yeah.
thanks.
And really what drives that is exactly what you just asked, is how we look at how we charge our customers. And right now there's that fixed threshold on the residential customers. It's 10 HCF or 100 cubic feet. And for single family, for multifamily 1 to 4 units, it's 800 cubic feet, and multifamily 5+ units is 700 cubic feet. And one of the pieces we need to evaluate as part of our cost of services, do these thresholds make sense? Or should those thresholds be changed as we go forward, and looking at what that threshold is based on? And really what we usually tie that threshold to is some average of winter water use for those residential type customers. And Santa Barbara's a little different. You don't have a winter like some areas of the state do, where summer water's way up here and winter water crashes back down to very low amounts. And so that's part of what we're looking at, is where should that line be drawn? And so if you look at single family, here's a profile of the average single family customer use from January to December. Well, so let me restate that. From July 7, 2017 to June 2018. But going across the chart, it's January to December. And you can see our limit is the black dotted line going right across at 10. And over this last year, only 1 month has the average residential customer, single-family customer, gone over that cap. Again, this is the average customer. This is what we design rates around. We don't design rates for each individual specific customer. And if you look at the average of this time period, it's just above 8 as part of that. That's what our current profile looks like. Now, if you look at February, March, and April, that's really where your low winter months kind of are. Again, this lags a little bit. It's water consumption data trending over the billing cycles. But you can see that's maybe closer to 6 or 7 for that real winter water period. And so this plays into that fixed variable discussion in the sense that if we were to change these thresholds, that could change that fixed and variable relationship, which then means we would want to adjust that to maintain the 50-50 split roughly as part of that. So those dollar amounts could change as part of this discussion. So that's one of our policy questions, is looking at the single family, should we bring that down? What we've talked about is, yes, it probably would make sense to drop that down now given your current consumption patterns as part of that, because really what we're trying to do for single family is charge for the wastewater that's coming back to the plant, not the irrigation water, which is really those peaks that we see in the summertime period.
Mr. Korn, maybe you can speak a little bit about when you actually take the wastewater flows that are coming in and work it backwards, what you would associate with each of our customers average, what does that look like?
Yeah, so generally when we're looking at this, we'll come back to that low winter period, and we'll look at that lowest wintertime use. So I'll give you an example. San Luis Obispo, their average winter water cap for their customers, and theirs is an individual basis, not a system-wide basis, they're down at somewhere around 4 HCF a month. And so that's that maximum cap. So in the summer, if you go over, or anytime you go over that cap, you're not charged for that wastewater or that water consumption because it's presumed not to come down the pipe. So when we're looking at winter water, that's really the driver because that's really what comes back to the wastewater treatment plant. And so, looking at that March number, which is somewhere around 6, that could be a cap that we come back to say that really captures our winter water. We have irrigation, in those winter months here in Santa Barbara, so we're trying to capture that component.
So just to understand it a little bit more clearly, when we have it at 10, that means that basically there's not a lot of incentive to conserve water because you're going to be charged that a fixed amount no matter what you do. You save on the water side because it's a little lower, but on the wastewater, you have no significant incentive. So by bringing it down, we have more of an incentive for conservation. Is that correct?
No, actually, I don't think it would be because if we bring it down, let's say we bring it down to 8. If you're going to use 9 or 8 in the winter and you use 10 in the summer, it's not going to provide that because we're going to cap it at the 8. So it's not going to give you that price signal maybe in the summertime period. But it does reflect the actual wastewater that's coming back down through the system. And that's really our goal here as part of this. We can still provide that consumption signal based on water up to that cap, but it's not really giving that price signal for those larger users.
So this is what I would say is kind of that hybrid between having, Goleta San, who has just a fixed rate. This is kind of, there is a fixed charge for having a connection to the sewer. It's for every HCF you use, you're going to be paying a certain amount, and then there's going to be this cap. And I think we're kind of looking at, we've recognized that those flows have changed since this last cap was established at 10. And staff believes it should be something less. And we could, the average being around 8, we could base it strictly on winter demands. And so what would happen is you're going to find that our customers are going to hit that cap more frequently. It will, by default, stabilize wastewater rates to some extent. And again, this is for single family. We actually have a different recommendation, and you'll see why when we get to multifamily, because typically they have separate irrigation meters, and so their usage is pretty flat year round. They don't have that indoor-outdoor element to their water usage.
So this is a cap. It's not the threshold between the fixed and the variable.
No, correct.
Okay.
It's the cap that they would be billed under.
I had misunderstood. Okay. Got it.
Yep, correct.
I want to make sure that I understand that too, because I had the same different understanding that, so this is the maximum that you would pay. So if you go over that as a single family, you're not being charged that extra, and you're proposing bringing that down because we're not actually going over that threshold that often.
That
so
is
it
a
would
correct
bring rates
statement.
down. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So if we're lowering the cap, are we then lowering the revenue coming in?
No, that's that balancing I was talking about. So that's where if we lower that cap, it could shift our fixed and variable from the 50-50 roughly today to something greater. The fixed may go up. So we may have to balance that back out through that fixed charge versus the consumption charge.
That's what I was wondering.
So that's where that's part of what the next steps is to look at, okay, how significant are those changes for some of the customers? Whether you're somebody that goes over 10 each month or you're somebody that stays at 4, what are those impacts to those customers as part of this? But ideally, as Joshua said, it's going to stabilize revenues a little more, because if you look at this, if you were to set it at 6, everybody essentially hits that every month. So that just balanced out our revenues, our revenue stability discussion. So even though we're at a split, we know about what we're going to get each month as part of that. So that's part of this discussion also, is allowing for those lower users to still have that reduced bill, essentially, or lower bill than another customer because of they use less, but stabilizing the overall revenues as part of the discussion.
Just maybe one more point on that. I think because we've had different perceptions of what that means, threshold and cap, that we may want to put some energy into phrasing that in a way that's, cost not to exceed this limit, or something in the wording of it, because it does look like, we're used to thinking of water rates, and that's your cap, and above that you're going to pay extra. So something on the slide itself that could.
Absolutely.
So in summary, I guess we're looking for any feedback. I think staff would probably be looking to set it more on the minimum, so somewhere around 6. So that would be an incremental. So people using less than 6 HCF, there would be some variable. There would be an encouragement to use less than 6 HCF. If you did, your wastewater bill would go down. But once you hit that 6, you're going to kind of hit that maximum wastewater bill. And any water usage over that is basically, the assumption is that's not coming to us in the sewer system.
So we'll kind of move forward what that looks like if we lower that, and we can bring that back.
We agree.
Okay. Little different picture here on the multifamily.
I have a quick question
absolutely.
on multifamily. Just
Multifamily or single family?
multifamily.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Because you kept saying 1 to 4 units. Where do we have a 1-unit multifamily?
I think that's just the definition that you have on the books. That's a good question.
I was a city planner, so I was like, you got 1 unit. That ain't multifamily.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Davis, I'd have to look into that, but we may have a classification for accessory dwelling units that would then be a single multifamily because it's attached. But it certainly bring up good point.
So this is slightly different than the single family, as Joshua alluded to. You see there's really not a change in those consumption patterns on a per living unit basis over the course of the year. And we have those caps set at 8 and 7, and our average is 4. And so something we talked about at the last commission meeting was, doesn't even make sense to have a cap for multifamily. And as Joshua talked about, they have a separate irrigation meter. So really this should be all indoor use. So I think where we're moving towards and recommending is that on multifamily there wouldn't be a cap, because they're going to have to, anything new, they're putting in a irrigation meter for all their outdoor needs. So really that cap isn't necessary, and if their characteristics change, all that water should be indoor. More folks in an apartment, et cetera.
Commissioner Burney couldn't be here today, but she wanted to pass along her support for not having a cap, in particular on multifamily.
So our last slide here on commercial, we're talking about our commercial rate designs and should they be charged the same. So we really kind of talked about this already. What we're doing in the cost of service is we are allocating costs around those customer types and the strengths that they are. So that's where we're coming back to look at, should we have that medium component? Essentially those commercial 3 and maybe some of the 2s. That's the piece that we're trying to dig into at this point in time. And then ultimately the cost of service will show us what that rate would be. And again, that's primarily based on those strength differences as we go forward. We're not talking about changing the commercial 4/industrial rate. We're looking at that. We're allocating cost to that class based on their characteristics, but we're not talking about doing anything different with that commercial class.
Could you just give us an idea of examples of what would be a 1, a 2, a 3, and then industrial?
Absolutely. You have a better, you want to?
Yeah, I brought our rate structure here just a moment. Councilman Ed and I haven't memorized these entirely, but looking at our class 3, so just off of our higher class users, we have establishments like food processing, or shopping centers, regional neighborhood shopping centers. That is all that's in class 3. Class 2 would be examples of mobile home parks, community apartment projects, industrial condos, hotels. That'd be class 2 right now. And then Class 1, I think Mr. Curran said this, kind of domestic use, like commercial uses, banks, institutional offices, and those types.
And so that Class 1 and most of the Class 2 are more residential type customers, mobile home parks or businesses that have a bathroom and a sink, right, for the employees to use. It's typical waste streams that we would see coming out of a home. We start getting into 3 and definitely into 4. That's where we're seeing more of the strength issue with food prep or other components like that, that we want to make sure we're capturing correctly as part of this.
There is a public comment speaker on this item, so let's get that out of the way before we go off into any other questions. So, Mr. Carlson.
Thank you. I'm Derek Carlson. I'm the business manager for Marburg Industries. And Marburg would, first of all, like to offer their support for this detailed analysis of the rates. We strongly believe in the detailed analytical review to set the rates. I'm a big data wonk as we do our business rate structures, and this is right up my alley. But it does pose one inquiry and one request as we take a look at this. We did notice that there is a separate category being created that we consider a Marburg category, being a septic and portable restroom waste. And so our curiosity is in what's the analytics in setting up a separate category for that. And then the request that we have is that we be included in the analysis of our waste stream. We do a lot of analysis now, and have a history of that analysis. And we have one of the foremost chemists that analyzes our waste on a continuous basis, and we believe we can bring a lot to the table as we're taking a look at it. I know there was one comment a moment ago about the waste all going at one time, so a strong volume. It's important to know, too, that we have a metered release at our facility, and that metered release does get diluted by the time it gets to the plant. And those kind of discussions are important to have, and I believe to have us at the table as we move forward with that analysis. So thank you.
Thanks. That was the last slide, right? Are you done?
No.
Oh, one more.
I thought you said last one. Sorry.
Sorry. I thought I had one more. So overall, I think the rate structures are contemporary and reflect industry best practices. Again, on the single family side, I think it is more equitable than a flat rate that you see in many other places. I think you've got that set up. It's just those thresholds. We've talked about those for residential and multifamily, so we'll move forward with that. We're going to continue working on the commercial 1 through 3, and then talking about the septic hauler rate as part of that as we go forward. And so really, I think we've got direction at this point. So we'll continue down that path of the cost of service. We'll draft those results and rate designs and come back to the ad hoc committee, the Water Commission ad hoc committee, and then the commission, and then finalize those, present our recommendations, and go through that rate setting process when the timing comes. And so that's really all I had. If there's any other questions or
Leave that one up
concerns.
there, and we'll see what other questions and comments are. Dave?
No, I was just going to say, Mr. Carlson's comments, given Marburg and their, if you will, the size of what they do in the community, including them in that analysis, and having them at the table would be quite helpful. So thank you for that.
Mr. Chair, commissioners, we have been meeting with, and we agree with Mr. Carlson. It's continuing that. We've been talking with them now, at least for the last 6 months, about septic waste and trying to analyze exactly the strength and what's coming in preparation for this, so that we can really identify those costs.
Excellent.
Well, this seems to be going in the right direction. I think two important things is one is promote water conservation, so I'm making sure that the incentives are there for people to do that. And then the other, we'll have a discussion on fog, but it seems to me that we should also try to promote fog in terms of separating it from the waste stream. And so whatever we can do in terms of rates that doesn't give the wrong direction, because I think there's additional benefits to having that as a separate stream, even though it may have some differences in the way that gets processed through the plant. One quick question. So we're upgrading also in terms of our wastewater treatment process, in terms of the micros that we have out there and the processing. How does that change, or does that have any significant effect on our overall cost to O&Ms, or no, we don't expect that to be significant?
No, it does have cost implications. And we are trying to put and project those out at this point because we certainly don't have the experience with it, but we will expect the new treatment process to go in place sometime in this new year. And so, but we do have, based on our consultant, has given us some expectations about the amount of ammonia we'll need to be feeding and other chemicals. So,
Mr. Chair, just one other comment that I have, and it's the 30,000 foot level relative to the messaging. That is, again, historically, I don't think people have really thought wastewater and water is two separate buckets, pun intended, in that regard. But I think the drought, because of the drought has been so severe here, we're now starting to think. I was just thinking back to our messaging of one water, but this all ties back in the messaging of one water. That in fact, usually you don't think of water conservation in terms of wastewater, but we have because of the drought. It's really been pounded into us now. So again, somehow as we go forward with the one water messaging, this all basically all comes back together.
And I would echo the inclusion of Marburg. They get a lot of grief for being the only one, but then that also gives them the opportunity to be the subject matter expert in what goes on the ground every day. So I take advantage of that. You had that one of those first slides up there was your targeted outcomes, and I think you're on track with the first one, which I can't remember what it is, but it's something like just do this responsibly and make sure you take everything into consideration. And I would support that, and I would like to make sure that, there you go, sufficient revenue to maintain. I know that this is an incredibly complicated process and that decisions get made in the background as you come to some of these decisions. And I'd also like to make sure that we're in agreement that we will be very transparent about some of those decisions we make that may put off decisions, financial decisions for the future. So we kick the can down the road for some things, whether or not we do, because I know those are political decisions, not necessarily statistical or money decisions. And then I would also support that everything we do, we maintain full reserves. I don't think anybody's in a position to even begin to think what the next natural disaster is that's going to hit us, and having full reserves at all times is really important. So, Councilmember, did you want to add anything, or are you going to get your 2 cents in later?
No, I just want to echo the same, that I think it is important to bring Marburg in, and the messaging on this is going to be very important, I think, and with the One Water. No, I'm very interested in the different tiers and how that plays out, and I think it is more equitable to have them be separated, and I think we're on the right track with this. Yeah.
And I also think when you come back through the gauntlet of the ad hoc and then back to Water Commission, I am pretty much thinking that's a full Water Commission meeting for this subject. And if that bothers you on a full Water Commission meeting, then maybe even call a special meeting, a second meeting that month just to do this. But I can see when you bring this back and you're ready to move it up to council that it's a 2-hour discussion on how and why and what we want to support. So I can see that quickly developing into a 2-hour meeting. So, okay. Is that good? All right.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So we'll move on to item 6B, which is, again, a policy direction action for the FOG program.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, Council Liaison, just kind of wanted to set the stage. So we've been at this for a while, trying to come up with a methodology for, I think, securing FOG material and equitable to all FOG haulers. And I think today we're really looking to have a discussion on this because there isn't a silver bullet that kind of solves this problem. We have laid out some options, and there are probably hybrids of some of these options we can talk about today. But it certainly is complicated. It's complicated by several factors, but we do recognize that there's a lot of FOG material out there in our community. And eventually, I hope we can take it all. That's where I think we want to go long term when we have the infrastructure to do that. But I think in the meantime, we're continuing to look for a hybrid solution that will continue to, I think, meet the capacity, the limited capacity that we have, and a process in which it's fair and equitable to the haulers that are currently in our community. Okay. And with that, I'll turn it over to Galen Fair.
Good morning. My name is Galen Fair. I'm the acting wastewater system manager. So we're coming to you today for policy direction on this fog disposal contract. We'll give you a quick background of the fog facility and why we have it. We'll review the options that we've explored so far, and then just summarize where we're at with everything.
So just walk you through, this is the, for those who haven't gotten a tour yet of the wastewater treatment plant, this is our fog receiving station. Fog haulers will pull up their trucks here, pump into this. They have a Victaulic fitting here they connect to and pump into the system. It goes into this 10,000 gallon insulated tank, which does have some mixing in there. We have pumps then and heated lines because this fog material can coagulate and turn into a solid. So we have heated lines that then take it over to, and you see the digester. This is one of 2 digesters that the city has that pumps it into those digesters. Keeping in mind that our digesters are living treatment systems, and so they appreciate their food coming in and a consistent and level means, and not having spikes causes disruption in treatment.
So a little bit of background. Our city has a fog program, and that is a little bit different than the fog that we're talking. It's the same fog, but it's inspecting restaurants, making sure that the food service establishments in the city are diverting fog. We don't want them to go down the drain and coat our sewer lines. So the picture you see there in the red is a grease trap. This is a pretty conventional setup at a food service establishment. And that prevents the grease from going down the drain. That fog that coats the sewer lines has the potential to cause sewer spills. And that is a beautiful photo of, yes.
Without a warning on that.
So that is what can happen if we don't divert the fog. Our fog facility, having haulers bring fog to our treatment plant has a lot of benefits. One of those, it provides local disposal. So the haulers that collect the fog in town don't have to truck their material to Bakersfield or Fresno or LA. It keeps it local. And then, as I discussed earlier, it keeps the fog out of the collection system. The reason that's so important, it reduces maintenance for our collection system staff, and it reduces our fog-related sewer spills. One of the other benefits, it increases gas production in our digesters. So as we pump the fog into our digesters, it produces methane. The bugs in there just eat it up and produce more methane. And that methane we can use for our cogeneration facility to create more electricity.
Just an interesting side note is we have years now of data, but it is very difficult to extract what energy value that fog material has. Certainly, it has the value of keeping minimizing trucking, but it has been very difficult, and we've actually reached out to Commissioner Keller and his students to see if they might help us with trying to extract from all the data that we have what is attributable to that fog material. And so we hope when we get through this process, we can actually kind of connect some of the gallons of fog to some type of energy value. But right now, staff, it has been, it's too difficult. There's so much variability in the solids that come into the digesters. It's too difficult to extract out the value, which to me says that the fog material energy value is fairly low, but we'll hopefully come back and be able to make some connections to that.
So this graphic, the picture on the left is actually CCTV inside one of our pipes, and what looks like stalagmites coming down is actually grease coating. the pipes. Our fog inspector, he's our wastewater collections specialist, compliance specialist. Thank you, Bradley. He goes out and he inspects all the restaurants. So you can see in over the last few years, we've really increased those inspections, and it has directly correlated to fewer sewer spills related to fog in our collection system. So that's why having this fog diverted is so important to the city. We have roughly 450 food service establishments in the city. Those tend to, one or two are always changing in and out, as you know. And we crunched some numbers, and we realized there's roughly 15,000 gallons of fog generated per week within the city. So it was a number we didn't really have a grasp on last time we came to you guys. You will see in the next slide what our capacity is. So we do have some room for receiving fog that is generated outside of the city. Again, a picture of our fog facility. It was constructed in 2013 as a pilot project. The fog gets hauled to El Estero from our haulers, injected into our digesters, which then produce methane and produce energy through our cogen facility. But the thing I want to point out is that this was a pilot project. So it was constructed to see, does this work? Will it work? Can we create more energy? So we are still working within the constraints of that facility and that infrastructure.
So the challenge that we struggle with, for those who've gotten a tour, is we don't have a lot of space at El Estero, and so we don't have room here to do pre-treatment of the fog material, and we don't have a lot of room for storage of the fog material. And so it definitely complicates, and that's just here on this specific intake. And then in addition to this, the electrical, we have an issue right now. APCD has a limit on our permitted capacity because of methane production, and so that is also another limitation. So there's multiple layers to the pilot and why we wanted to do something to kind of get some experience with it, but there are several limitations that kind of keeps us from doing more.
What was the original sunset on the pilot, or was there a time frame given to evaluate? No.
So that was a very nice segue. Thank you. So our APCD permit gives us a weekly capacity of 30,000 gallons. However, based on our infrastructure limits, we do have a flare capacity. Our electrical distribution is restricting us. So as we've come to showing you what our capital projects are, both of these are in the works. We're replacing our flare. We're getting a new one that will be able to burn more. And the electrical distribution will be upgraded within the next 5 years. But because of these constraints, staff is not necessarily comfortable at that 30,000 gallon that our permit allows. So we're being conservative at 25,000 gallons per week. And that will be the limit that we're going to use for our RFP criteria. So our existing hauler requirements, this is what we're requiring our haulers to maintain as they bring the fog material in. Maintain a pH of between 6 and 9. They have to screen to a 3/8 inch, and that's to protect our infrastructure, our facility. You know, we don't want any cutlery coming through, as I'm sure they don't in theirs. And also to provide manifests for each load of fog delivered. And this is an item that we haven't been too strict on, but moving forward we will likely button that up a little bit tighter.
What's that mean? It's a
What's
piece
that?
of paper, I get it, but why? What's the reasoning, or what's on the manifest that's an issue?
The manifest would provide where the fog comes from,
Okay.
volume, and I think those are the two big ones.
Literally site specific. Where? So that's not something you know right now.
No.
It's just somebody bringing in a truck and dumping it off, and we don't know if it's coming from 10 restaurants in town or 10 restaurants in the county.
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
And that will help with one of our options as well. So what are the options? Here's are the options that we've been exploring to put into the RFP. Use the capacity based on in-city service. Or do we look at equal capacity per hauler? Or do we just say, hey, who's willing to pay the highest to dispose of the fog at our facility? So option one, as I mentioned, it would just be a percentage of the fog capacity allocated based on the fog collected within city limits. So this option requires manifest from the prior year to determine the percentage of in-city fog that each hauler services. So there's two parts to this allocation. There's a base capacity plus an excess capacity. Base capacity is pretty easy to figure out. If you're collecting 50% of fog generated in the city limit, you receive 50% of El Estero's capacity. So what does that look like? At our 25,000 gallon per week limit, the hauler would receive 50% of that, or 12,500. However, there could be excess capacity. Go ahead. Okay. That's okay. So if we have two bidders and that only covers 70% of the fog collected within the city, we still have that 30% of capacity left over. So we would proportionally divide that up between the bidders.
What if a bidder had 100% of what they were collecting was from in the city? Do they get 100% of the
So it would be
capacity?
based on, let me go back to the previous slide.
So just to clarify, you're asking if a single bidder had 100% of the food establishments in town?
Is this the number of the food establishments in town, or I
Yes.
thought this was,
This is based on food establishments in the city.
so that numerator, the fog collected from the city, that's not a volume of?
Yes, it would be.
So what if all the fog they collected was from, oh, I see, over the total fog produced in the city?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
What we're attempting to try and accomplish here, we get to, I guess, the benefits and challenges of this, is try to incentivize fog haulers to compete for city customers, because the more city customers they have, the more capacity they will get of El Estero and El Estero.
Thank you. He's stealing my thunder over here. So benefits, obviously, like Joshua just said, incentivize our fog haulers to keep the business local. And the other portion of that is it keeps the fog waste local. So if the city of Santa Barbara is generating a good amount of grease, we don't want to have our haulers truck them, again, Fresno, Bakersfield, LA. Keep it local. If we can receive that fog and use it for benefits at El Estero, that would be great.
Question, and in my ignorance, are any of the other facilities in town doing fog? Montecito, Goleta,
No.
Goleta West. So we're the only one on the South Coast.
Right. The closest one I believe is Hill Canyon, which is just outside of Camarillo, treats
Yep.
Newberry Park. Yeah.
That's Thousand
Thousand
Oaks.
Oaks. Yeah. And they were offline for a while, and now are back online.
And they take anybody?
They have a list of approved folks that can deliver, but they have they do screening on site and they have storage on site.
I used to work for the city of Thousand Oaks. Hill Canyon is a municipal facility, so that's why I asked. Okay.
And to put it in perspective, Hill Canyon will take 35,000 gallons per day, whereas we're looking at 25,000 gallons per week. So they have a much bigger facility. Some of the challenges for option one is it would be a little bit more administrative work for staff each year. What we're thinking of for this is every year reevaluate the portion that each hauler is servicing in city. So that would be more work for staff, crunching more numbers. And it may increase truck traffic at El Estero.
I got a question on that. Again, I just couldn't see. If, in fact, you've got X amount of fog and you're going to use it to the maximum capacity, your 25,000, aren't the number of trucks basically going to stay the same as just where they come from?
Yeah.
Well, and it depends. I mean, you might have a hauler come in with 2,000 gallons that day and another one come in with 2. And so to that extent, it could.
Yeah, in terms of peaking, but in terms of number of, again, I just read, increases trucking. It's in trucking out of town, trucking in town, it's X amount, right?
Yeah.
And you can only divide it up so many ways, and Anyway, there's too many angels on the head of the pin.
Yeah, and I think the other part and gets back to the administration is how to divvy up the daily capacity that we have, because we don't have an unlimited.
I understand, because when you said administrative capacity, I took it on that record-keeping side, not so much on the operation side. So
Yeah.
that actually is an additional component, which I hadn't thought about.
Yeah, I mean, we do have people at the plant 7 days a week, and so in theory we could take deliveries every day, but it gets challenging to schedule those deliveries, and I would imagine any hauler is going to want to maximize their truckloads to the plant, and so to that extent, there are complications with how exactly this would be administered.
Option 2. This option would be everybody who bids gets a chance. So they would get an equal capacity. If we have 5 haulers responding to the RFP, divide up our weekly capacity by 5, each gets 5,000 gallons per week. Benefits, everybody gets a chance. Everybody can dispose of the fog locally. This one would definitely increase truck traffic at El Estero. Having multiple trucks coming in. The other part about that is obviously each hauler would get a much lower volume allocated, and some of these trucks are up to 5,000 gallons per truck. So if you get 1 truck per week, might not be worth it.
Yeah.
So it creates some challenges for the hauler on that side.
We are unaware outside of Marburg any of the other haulers have the capabilities of pretreatment at this point. We have, I think we've had 2 others that have reached out to us, but none of them have the capabilities to pretreatment, so they wouldn't. Difficulty is I don't know that there would be anybody else who would qualify.
Mm-hmm.
If someone made a bid, but the bid is a lot higher than the other bids, you still give them an equal share?
This would not be based on cost. We would establish the cost of service of whatever it is. So
Yeah, we would establish those costs for options 1 and 2. And then here's our third option. Pretty much whoever wants to pay us the most would receive the full capacity. There are some restrictions. There's a certain dollar amount to trucking it out of town that obviously if someone's going to be able to pay less to truck it out of town, they will. So there is a cap on that. It won't go too high. But whoever would be willing to pay the most would get the full capacity. Benefits of this, single hauler coming through. It would be easy to administer, and we would be receiving fair market value for our fog. One of the challenges, though, is that it's not going to capture, it has the potential to not capture all of the in-city fog generated. If a hauler only collects 10% of the city's fog, they get to dispose of everything else here. So that's one of the challenges. It does have the potential to increase costs for disposal, either for the hauler or for the food service establishments that are using their services.
But we do believe there's a kind of a cap to that because there are alternatives that are out there.
Mm-hmm.
But
Kind of goes to my question. If in fact we don't capture, if one of our goals is to keep the fog out of the city's system, in order to keep a clean system, what are the regulations on cleaning out the grease traps from some other kind of requirement? Does everybody still have to clean their
Oh,
grease
absolutely.
traps?
Absolutely. It's just a matter of who.
Who and where you dispose of it?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So because of the regulation and cleaning it out, quote unquote, we should, within some type of enforcement, essentially the city system is protected one way or the other.
correct.
Yes.
And I think there's kind of an upper limit to this. The Hill Canyon charges 10 cents a gallon for disposal, and then they obviously have the treatment there, and they do have some holding tanks. So that's kind of the upper limit to be that plus trucking. So I think there's already kind of some boundaries. I believe at least one, Coastal Byproducts, that's kind of their destination for their local city fog material is the Hill Canyon.
I was going to ask, I'm still not clear. And so on several of these, it says the uncertainty regarding fog haulers' ability to meet the fog pretreatment criteria. Do we have higher standards for that than other facilities that accept fog?
I think the other facilities weren't pilots, and they built their own pretreatment and storage capacity just because of space. And so I think that kind of puts us in this unique situation. And I think part of why I think there was some partnership early on with Marburg on they did make that investment in that pretreatment.
So Marburg has the capacity for pre-treatment, but to your knowledge, there aren't other haulers who currently have that capacity?
Correct. It doesn't mean they wouldn't install it. There may be the financial incentive for them to install it, but at this point, I haven't heard of anyone else.
So for any of these options, if there was just one qualified bidder who was able to meet it, then that would go to...
Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So our next steps, we're here today to receive policy direction from you on all these three options. We're hopeful to get an agreement approved in early next year, maybe March. And we're looking at a 5-year agreement for that. So with that timeline, that will allow us to get our electrical project complete. And the flare would be upgraded at that time. And during the time, we would be evaluating our infrastructure for the fog facility. Do we need to expand? Do we need to include pretreatment at our site? Can we? Is it feasible? So we're going to be evaluating all of that as we move forward. And come March 2024, after the 5 years have been up, we will be in a better place to hopefully accept quite a bit more fog. That's the goal. And
All right, there's a public comment speaker again. Mr. Carlson, you're up again.
Morning again, Derek Carlson with Marburg Industries. Thank you. So Marburg has been partnering with the city for the past 5+ years in operating a very effective fog recycling program. And so in order to qualify for this partnership, Marburg invested over $400,000 in a pre-treatment facility. And at our pre-treatment facility, we screen and grind all of the fog material before we pump it into our insulated and heated storage tanks, where the fog is heated to a toasty 86 to 91 degrees, where it is constantly pumped and massaged to meet the proper viscosity. And we've also invested in over $16,000 in storage capacity. So we are able to be flexible with the city's needs as to when they do and don't need the fog. All of this investment that we've made was done because there isn't the space at the current city facility. At the time, the city didn't want to spend the money on doing this. It was a pilot program to see if it worked. And it has worked, and it has worked successfully. And where we are now in our partnership, as we see it, we're in an extended pilot period. 5 years ago, we thought that we would possibly be looking at a bigger project at El Estero, where we would be taking, instead of 3,000 gallons a day, 30,000 gallons a day with a project build-out. Today we're not there. Maybe in 5 years from now, as projected by the current proposal, we are going to be there with an extended cogen facility. But right now, we are working, as we're concerned, under a extended pilot program. And we've developed our customer base to feed this particular project with the city. 98% of all of our fog customers are in the county of Santa Barbara, and 98% of those are right here on the South Coast, with 80% being in the city of Santa Barbara. And so we've designed our customer base basically to feed this facility. The money that we spend on the infrastructure initially and on the continued energy costs and processing costs to feed the cogen plant is what we are spending instead of trucking this material to other locations. And we haven't expanded our program to get every customer in Santa Barbara County and Orange County and LA County. We are feeding the program in this partnership that we have right now. We believe that at this time, the proposal to go out and get additional haulers to build a additional facility that's going to be built out of town somewhere is not going to fulfill the environmental goals that any of us are looking to accomplish right now. And right now, we have a facility 2 blocks away that we built for this pilot that's working wonderfully. And it is our suggestion that we extend the pilot program for another 5 years so we can continue to receive the benefit from this pilot program. And then at the future date, when we have the opportunity to expand this program into a larger, full-blown cogen operation, then we take that opportunity to see what else may be out there and what may benefit the project at that time. But today we have a great program that has been working for the past 5 years, and we feel that we are in the optimum place to continue this pilot program to be working successfully so we can have a build-out. Confusing the pilot program now with an additional traffic material from an untested facility, a yet unbuilt facility, could tamper with a successful pilot that then could jeopardize the build-out of a larger program. So our suggestion is we stick with what's working on the pilot program and address future options when we have a different project to consider. Thank you.
Derek, could I ask you a question? You lost me on your percentages. You're 98 in the county, 80 in the city. How about what of all the city customers out there? How much do you think you serve?
Well, that's a good question. I do not have the city's data on how many restaurants that they have. So I know that 80%, around 80% of our customers are in the city of Santa Barbara. But if you gave me a list of restaurants, we could cross-check it. I just don't have that information to say how many restaurants
do you have the gallons that you handle per week?
So we are delivering, and Anthony has one of the statistics, but about 3,000 gallons a week is what we're delivering to the city, and that's basically what we're collecting. And as I said, if the city needs more gallons, we can expand our customer base, but we've kind of designed our customer base around this project. I mean, it was a partnership we started, and that's the parameters that we're building around.
And that 3,000 gallons, is that generally in and out, and whatever you're holding just averages out?
So it is in and out, and it depends on what the cogen facility is asking for. So there's sometimes they say, don't bring us anything.
Right.
And so then we have to hold for a longer period of time. And then we also hold until we can make a delivery in a large truck. So 5,000 gallons at a time, if that's what the city is looking for. So there's one load going there versus having 5 trucks bringing 1,000 gallons at a time.
But you're happy with, over the course of the year, 3,000 gallons a week kind of coming in, going over there? That would be a number to use?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
So just before I forget this question for staff, so you guys are estimating almost 15,000 gallons weekly generated in the city. They're saying they have 80% of the city's service.
80% of their customers are in the city.
I'm sorry, okay. But we don't know what the real number is. Okay, all right. Okay.
They're handling about 3,000.
So on those numbers, there's a whole bunch of people going elsewhere that are in the city, right?
What were
Obviously.
the estimates? Can you share we did some cursory estimates on how much we believe we're coming Marburg in city, coastal byproducts in city, and then others.
If memory serves, I don't have the data in front of me. It was roughly 28%, 30% of Marburg's, based on gallonage, is serviced in city.
And then it was approximately 30% others, which those others may be taking their waste to Marburg. They may be collecting it and then bringing it to their, I don't know. We don't know where that, we didn't have a spokesperson from them who reached out to us. And then coastal byproducts, as we know, I think they have a pretty significant share of city, and that right now
Around 45%.
goes down to Oxnard, gets processed or taken to Hill Canyon as best we can understand.
So you just said you think 28% of Marburg's business they bring to you is city, right?
Correct. No.
No?
28% of the city's,
Food service establishments.
Okay. All right.
yes.
So 72% you think is wandering out of town right now?
Potentially.
Okay.
Or going to Marburg.
Okay. Questions, comments?
So if you have X amount that's basically being generated and we can handle this amount, the difference is going to go out of town one way or the other. It's just who carries it out of town.
We have, since our weekly capacity is about 25,000 gallons, from our numbers, the city is only generating about 15,000. So we have an excess of 10,000 we can take from outside of the service area.
Okay. And Marburg is bringing how much of that amount per week?
I think their numbers are about 17,000 per week.
Okay.
3,000 per day.
3,000 per day.
Okay. That's where the disconnect.
Yeah, that was the number difference. I go back to my big question, and maybe I'm not seeing it or articulating it correctly. If you've got X amount total being generated within the South Coast, so much can basically go to our facility, right? The difference then all has to go out of town.
Yes.
Okay? If our facility is going to be on any of these options or continuing the pilot program is going to use our capacity, the amount going out of town is going to stay the same. Right? So it's just what goes to our facility.
And the feedback we got from the commission last time we talked about is the preference, trying to create a preference for in-city customers first. Even though you're right, there will be South Coast fog material leaving the area.
But so again, I remember that. So, but again, this has refined even my thinking since then to understand it a little bit further. So, how do I say this? The city sewer-based system basically is going to be the same either way. That was my earlier question. And then the number of trucks in and out really going to stay the same out of the region, I mean, because you got to get that stuff out of here one way or the other. So those two basically neutralized. Okay? So then it comes down to what are the benefits or costs to the city? Well, the administrative costs, the truck traffic at El Estero, pre-treatment questions and that type of thing. Or actually, for me, then would become the decision-making factors. If the other two are neutralized, trucks in or out doesn't really matter regionally. I'm not talking about a facility, but regionally that stays the same. The city sewer system doesn't change either because the grease traps have to be handled one way or the other. So it's really those other factors are the ones that basically are the weighing factors. If I look at the administrative costs and the truck traffic and the pretreatment, I'd go to Marburg, stay with what you got.
Well, the challenge then becomes, I think when we went down this road, we weren't aware that anyone else was interested. And I think it brings back to an equity issue is how did we go about selecting
I
a
understand
selection
that,
process?
but again, I'm just going to Mr. Carlson's proposal, which was really option 4, right? It would be an option 4, and that would be consider this still a pilot program, not an open program, and to negotiate the contract just for a 5-year period as you look at what the larger question is going to be in terms of where you're going to go in the future. I mean, again, that's what I saw that would be was an option 4 that was put on the table. Call it again, you're not dealing with the equity question because you're not opening this particular process for bidding. You're basically saying that essentially it's a pilot program or an extended pilot program with the operator that we've got because of administrative costs, et cetera, down the line as to why you would do that. That is, again, the request that, at least that was put forward here today.
I kind of like that too, although I'm not really following it. And I think I talked a little bit about this last time. And to me, the weighing of this is respecting Marburg's past relationship and investment in your pilot project, while maybe what you're raising up is the inequity thing. And I kind of like this avenue out, a fourth choice. To me, the number one goal in this program is to protect the city systems. And so our number one focus should be on taking care of city customers. And so I could see some version of what Dave just talked about with a time period and the message to Marburg being that in that time period they need to increase their city customers because that's where we want their product coming from. And whatever that means on their end to work with on rates and how they get to those city customers and who they are, that's their problem. But the next time you get to the review on this, whether that's a year or 2 years, 5 years, whatever it is, and you're ready to take it from a pilot program to a real program and actually open it up to the equity question, that should be their burden, is to show that their role in this process is to serve city customers and protect the city system. That's the only blemish I see to the whole thing right now, is the amount of the guy that's not in the room that's doing city business and the guy that's in the room that should be doing more city business in terms of doing it, but that's balanced off by their historical both support of the program and dollar investment in the program, to me. I mean, you could also accomplish the same thing just by writing an RFP so restrictive to grinding and storing and heating and pre-treating that it essentially takes the other people out of it because they don't have $500,000 to invest. But I still think that leaves off the table. I'm not entirely comfortable with the percentage of their customers that aren't in the city, or the ones that are in the city. I think that percentage needs to be increased, because I think I should be paying to help service that function with city customers and not customers that are outside the city. Yes, ma'am.
I very respectfully disagree.
Uh-oh.
This came about because we were up for renewal with the contract with Marburg, and then other players in the city who are handling 45% of city fog said, you've never had an RFP, you've never had this open in the pilot stage or this stage, and if you're renewing a contract for another 5 years, that's a shutout. And if you're suggesting that Marburg up their city game, then that's increased pressure on the local fog hauler, pushing them out of business. I don't, on multiple fronts. I mean, I see that from the city perspective, yes, it's added administrative cost. There's extra cost to option one. Marburg has invested in the pilot program. We still aren't the number one choice facility because we're requiring this pre-treatment, which other facilities don't. So an individual business would have to make that decision. Is it worth my while to invest in the pre-screening so that I can keep it in Santa Barbara, or is it worth my while to go out of the county, out further away, where I don't have to pre-treat, pre-screen, and go that way? That's an individual business decision. But I do think, because we've never had an RFP on this, and it is extended, if you're talking about another 5-year extension of a pilot program, that's 10 years where there just isn't an opportunity for another business who is already taking care of 45% of the city fog. So I don't think there should be preference for one or the other. I like option one, even though it has added administrative, because it promotes taking care of our local fog locally. Outside of that, I think, if there's no other bidder who's able to pre-screen, then that's taken care of in the bidding process. But at least there was a bid. It was open. These are our parameters. They can be quite strict parameters. We need to take care of our facility, and having that be pre-screened, and it sounds like it's a very expensive investment to do that. And I don't think it's for us to decide whether who is willing to make that investment at this point, who isn't, where they take it. I think we should just keep it very simple in our scope, that we prioritize local fog being processed locally. And beyond that, whoever can do that, I think is to the benefit. And I think with Marburg has a regional advantage there too. Not advantage, I don't want to say that. I'm thankful that Marburg takes fog regionally and handles that. And our being the only facility in the region is complicated also. So I think we would have to talk about, okay, maybe not just the city, then the county, and then why would we be prioritizing county fog? And I think to me, it's very simple priority. Local fog, as much as we can, processed locally, and then that's it on the RFP with the percentage calculation. And I think because it is so onerous doing the pre-screening, I mean, I think we're going to end up with Marburg being the only viable bidder. But I would like to see it open once for an RFP because of the history of never having been.
Councilmember Sten, I think you kind of nailed that exactly, and I think maybe it also sets us up for what we're going to do after this pilot phase is over, and potentially, like I said, more competition for our in-house city fog is good for our customers. Mm-hmm.
So if you made me pick one of those, that would be the one I pick. But what I'm most uncomfortable with is the city role and how we got here. We essentially put the parameters on Marburg to end up where they are. And in hindsight, which is always a little better, Monday morning, we should have been working harder to ensure that the pilot program was serving local customers only, local city customers only. And that would have solved a little bit of my discomfort in regards to the investment they made and their role in the process. So we let them, we were complicit in that process and in the investment they made in their participation, and we allowed that to become whatever their percentage is only of city and these other players out there who have that percentage too. And I think I just think that's unfortunate. I don't know if it's fair. I don't like to say things are fair or unfair, but that's really the basis of my discomfort. But I agree with everything you said on the reason to pick that one. It just seems unfortunate in the way we've arrived here.
May I ask you, in how many years would it play out that their $500,000 investment would have been spent and amortized and worth its while? Is that 20
Good point.
years? And 45% of the city's fog is being handled in a different way. Right. So I appreciate the initial investment. Also, still being able to benefit from that investment, still being able to dump at El Estero too. And I believe that they will probably be the only viable bidder who's able to meet the requirements of what's needed. It's just that the historical, that's how it started, and then that's how that should just continue. I'm not comfortable with that part.
I have a question for Mr. Carlson, if you could. So again, Commissioner Jordan has raised this question relative to essentially if it was a continued pilot program in some form, as you talk about, putting some type of incentive in there to increase the number of city connections. You want to comment on that, or anything else you want to ask?
Yeah, I do think that's important to address. And number one, I'd just like to address that number that's being thrown around, the 45%. That's not something that we've ever corroborated, and I know the city's come up with that number, and it's probably based on capacity of what people are permitted in their grease traps to have. But the gallons that we have coming into the facility that Marburg is pumping, 30,000 gallons a year, roughly 3,000 gallons a day, 6 days a week, and 80% of our customers are in the city. That's 24,000 gallons of the about 30,000 gallon capacity is coming from city customers. And I know there's different ways to estimate how many gallons people have in the ground, and if they got pumped twice a week, and if everybody had that same average, here's what the averages are. And I'm sure there was some sort of exercise to come up with that number because the commission asked for it. I'm not comfortable with that number that's being given to you. That is not the number that I have based on the number of gallons that I know that we're pulling out of the ground, based on the location of the customers that we're serving. All of that is known data. So if that is something that is weighing this decision on Marburg having 20-some% of the city customer base and everything else is coming from out of town, that is incorrect data from the numbers that I have.
So just to clarifying, so what you're saying is of what goes into El Estero, almost 100% of that is from city customers per your estimations?
Yes, 80% of what Marburg is collecting is coming from city customers.
Thank you.
What I think, and hopefully you would agree that in this scenario, if you're right, it would be based on, in under option one, bidders would just submit. They would have to show a manifest of what's coming from the city and what's not. It sounds like Marburg would basically end up with the majority share of the capacity, hands down, if that is accurate. So it sounds like in many ways we're saying and agreeing to the same thing in that.
Yeah, we're talking different things. What is the capacity in the city versus what is currently being brought to the facility? And it is true that there's additional capacity out in the city that is not being brought into the facility. That is also true. So there is a certain percentage of city customers that have material going out of town that would happen either way because of the limited capacity we have now.
Can I ask, does all of your fog come to El Estero, or do you have an excess that then goes somewhere else?
It all comes to El Estero.
So this takes care of all of your needs because you ramped up your need to meet the capacity of this particular
Correct.
facility. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, your comments also ring with me. Unfortunately, what happened is this is a pilot program, right? And we went in to extend the pilot program, and we had another hauler come in and say, well, no, I want to be part of this program. But we had never said this is no longer a pilot. This is now full on, and now we want to write the rules for the full on. And we just got, it seems to me we're kind of like midstream. We got caught midstream in that regard, and now essentially are trying to make the rules as we go forward in something which is no longer a pilot. And the equity issue was the fact that, well, again, we had a local hauler which said, no, I'm collecting in the city. I want to take my stuff here. So, again, I come back to this, to the equation as to in-city, out-of-city. I would probably still lean towards extending the pilot and basically say we need to basically look forward to the end of the pilot program, where we're going to be, and what our long-term requirements are going to be for who we're working with. And again, maybe it is the fact that other people can't do pretreatment and bring the materials. They wouldn't be raising their hand saying, I want in, if they couldn't, though, I would assume. And do we know that? They'll bring, their materials essentially are going to meet our standards?
They would have to, in talking with them, they would have to truck it down to their facility in Oxnard to do the pre-screening and then bring
it back.
Yeah,
so
essentially, we're not eliminating the truck traffic out of town.
Yeah, no, see, again, I just come back to, we're caught midstream, and we're going to get wet one way or the other. So I still lean towards, extending the pilot, just calling it. Well, I hear you, equity questions, extending the pilot program. Essentially, we meet the city needs, right? And in fact, going forward, in 5 years, when this comes forward, the pilot will now say, this is for the end of the pilot program, and at that point, our requirements are going to be X, Y, and Z, and then at that point, we'll be looking at the long-term options of how we do that, do the facilities intake. Anyway, that's kind of where I'm leaning.
I think, extend the pilot program was basically to look at the feasibility and making sure that we could actually handle it and all that, testing out different things. And I think this is part of testing out. We look for, could other haulers be participating in the program? If we continue with the current situation, in 5 years, we won't have other haulers yet with experience. So basically what we're saying is we won't have that. So I think it may turn out that no one can do it. I mean, it may make no sense to take it to Oxnard, bring it back. It may not make for others haulers. It's too small or low. They can't really do it. And that's a good outcome if that turns out to be the case and we have one that really can do it really well. No? But I think otherwise we're not really exploring all the options with the pilot. No?
Yeah, and again, again, my heart goes out to the fact that we set up a situation where we said, we want to do this pilot. In order to be part of the pilot, you got to go out and basically take on a large capital investment and increase your service locally to local people, not shipping to Oxnard. They do that, and now somebody says, "Oh, but I want to." You got my drift. That's
right.
I sit right there and.
But they Margaret still has the ability to continue doing and recover.
100%. If you went to option one,
yeah.
my intuition for everything we've heard is that Marburg basically will be the primary person bringing there. It may affect their business model to a certain degree, but anyway, I would lean towards, my preference would be lean towards calling it a pilot and extending the pilot. But if in fact the consensus was to go otherwise, it would be option one.
Josh, will you remind me? I'm pretty sure we talked about this and it went up to council. And what was council's direction? Didn't this go up and get discussed at council also?
Then agreed that we would go out for an RFP
All right.
with it.
So this has been fun, but that was that was kind of already addressed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a matter of the terms, right?
Correct.
And unless you just want to ignore the always common sense of Councilmember Sneddon and go back to council, but with a recommendation otherwise. So I just want to make. I was pretty sure that was what I remembered too. So given that, would the commission favor option one with other input into that option? Would that be the direction to go?
Good.
All right. What other input? Yes, ma'am.
I just want to add that I deeply respect this commission, and I would not give a recommendation counter to what the commission decided to recommend. I'm here to just voice different things that have been voiced to me through constituents and local businesses, but I'm not a voting member on this
I
commission,
am
and
not
I
going
would
to
bring that
ignore your
forward.
pulse on the finger either. So I think everything you said is definitely worthwhile considering. You guys aren't even jumping. So the better of the choices to me would be option one. I would continue to stress, without being so blatant, I would continue to stress the pre-treatment and storage and heating and massaging things that Marburg does to make the product conducive to your processing as a requirement, and some type of prioritization or requirement of city customers. Whatever do you think that will look like? I mean, to me, part of the goal is, again, to not end up with somebody who for some reason gets those shares somehow, but ends up bringing more product from outside the city than inside the city. Now you're explaining it in a way that wouldn't happen, but I'm not smart enough to figure out how somebody would game that. So that's Dave.
I'm just going to stick with my position. I will probably, if you want to just say that the majority of the commission felt that, but there's a minority opinion that wanted to extend the pilot program, because I think the city sewer system stays the same. I think the number of trucks, I didn't even understand to go to Oxnard and come back. That just complicates my mind even further. The administrative costs, the truck traffic to El Estero, and the pretreatment questions, to me basically say the rest of the world isn't ready for prime time. Marburg is, and extending the pilot program is the best for me. But again, I'll be a minority.
But to be a devil's advocate and not support my own position with you, maybe that does spurn a competitor to not drive.
That was our
right?
turtle's point, and I respect that
Yeah.
greatly.
I don't know that it does or not. I just don't know
I
why
got that. And
we're.
again, I go back to that. This was the pilot, which we were not clear that this was the end or the beginning of a new system. And we got caught twixt in between because we were already out essentially with extending for a 5-year period. And that was reflecting, why we were doing that was reflecting the investment that they had made and the, if you will, partnership we had entered into.
Yep.
And again, I understand the equity question. Okay, some of these things, they're tough calls. So I'll leave it at that.
I think part of it too is to recognize, at least from Coastal Pride Products, and it's unfortunate that they're not here today to represent themselves, but part of the dialogue, and I don't know if it's profitable for them, but these are trucks coming up to Santa Barbara every day from Oxnard already. These
Right.
people all live in Oxnard. They come up here. Right now they go home with full trucks. And the question is, do they go home with a full truck and come back with a full pre-treated truck and dump it at El Estero in the morning?
A world harder. Come on, don't do that.
I'm just saying that already is occurring.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if it's profitable for him. And I agree. At this point, just based on the investment that Marburg has made, they should dominate this market and provide the best service for our customers. So I hope that option one works. I mean, we can bring it back a little more developed to the commission for further discussion, but it is there, like I had started off with, there is no silver bullet for this one. It's difficult, and I think what we tried to do is give a few options and then strike the balance with what do we want to see in 5 years, and how do we want to approach it.
So do you want to bring it back?
It's all up to the commission. If you
Well, not here
you've given
today
us some
and-
pretty good feedback, and I'm happy to run with that and put out an RFP, and we'd bring back obviously that agreement when we had it. But if you want us to develop it more and come back, we could do that too.
May I ask one more question? Do we have an idea for the restaurants who are paying for their fog to be collected and taken out? If it's a comparable cost, are they paying the same? I'm more interested in for our local businesses who, sewer system the same, and the pre-treatment the same, the facility the same. So why I know I understand the 45% number, and that's not verified, and I don't know what that is, but in the spirit that competition does allow for a benefit to our local businesses, I'm just curious if that.
We did ask. We asked, and I think for both companies, it was proprietary information, and they weren't interested in sharing that.
Okay. I think that would be my one added. This is clearly onerous to have an RFP, to go through all this effort, to then have the administrative costs, to then potentially change what you're bringing where, and the investment that you've made. I truly am just trying to represent the perspective that's been brought to me from a hauler who's, managing a large amount of the city business, but then also for the city customers, I'm uncomfortable with anything that prioritizes only one choice. And I won't say anything further on that. I'm comfortable with whatever the commission decides.
So is there any downside for you guys if we say that the commission majority today thinks that further fleshing out of option one would be appropriate, and incorporating the comments we made, and then possibly also trying to shore up your percentages of service with the two local companies that we know, and maybe make another attempt at rate information, and then bring that back to commission at the next opportunity we can?
Yeah.
Is there any downside to you guys just not continuing on the way we're continuing on and stalling a month or two on that?
It's fine. I think we made a commitment to try and get a new agreement, but the way that our agreement right now with Marburg, it'll just continue to roll forward as it is. So it'll just be no change. So we're fine. We're fine bringing that
Derek's in the house, so he's kind of heard. He stands up and got one percentage. We have a different percentage. You have a different percentage. So I think some talk on fixing up the percentages that we're all confused about, and maybe some rate information, and maybe talking to the other person that stood up to, and maybe then just fleshing that out a little bit, and that being part of continuing on with, presuming you're going to go with option one, but coming back with some more details on that.
Yeah, and I think also getting a commitment of whether or not they can meet the criteria because we're not planning on changing our screening criteria. And so if they're not, we can bring that back to the commission and let you know as
That's
well.
important.
So we're all
That
in
would
agreement
change
on
the
that, right?
game.
That the whole pretreatment protocol would be a minimum requirement on the RFP. Okay. Okay. All right.
Okay.
Is that good?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you. So where we stand on the agenda, we got another hour.
I mean, we have another hour to work on the agenda? Yeah. So,
Yes, I'm just we got an update on the SSMP, and then we have a in-depth water supply.
Can we continue the is there a date? No, you're going to January 29th. We have a water commission meeting before the 29th. Yes?
On the SSMP?
Yeah.
Yes.
so could we put that off to January's meeting?
Did we need any feedback prior to that?
I don't think so.
Informational
Yeah.
and to just update on the process.
So,
Okay.
do we
Move
need
to
a motion,
continue.
or can we just do that?
Move to continue that to the January meeting.
We can do that.
Second?
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye, okay, so let's do that. And Do you want to try and squeeze Kelly and your report in, or?
Kelly's priority. I don't think I have anything.
Okay. So, Ms. Dyer, let's invite you up, and we'll run that one into the ground and then get out of here. I remember the conversation on the fog being a pretty long conversation last time, too. So I guess my input would be when it comes back to us again, maybe want to set aside some time, because there'll be 2 additional people here that want to chat about it, too.
Okay.
So,
Good morning, Mr. Chair, good Water Commissioners, Councilmember Sneddon. My name is Kelly Dyer. I'll be giving the drought update and annual water supply management report this morning. And so we will discuss the drought status, our demand status, water supply status, our water supply strategy, and also the 2018 annual water supply management report. So drought status, rainfall for the year, Gibraltar's at about 4.78 inches. Kachuma has seen 2.88 inches, and downtown Santa Barbara has seen 3.74 inches. So it's actually looking better than it has in previous years. We're pretty close to normal rainfall, which has been nice to see. This is a chart showing the drought monitor for the entire state of California. The federal agencies have now put us into a extreme drought condition, so they upped our category, and you can see the rest of the state is looking pretty dry as well. Just a reminder that we have already experienced the 7 driest consecutive years in our region. We're now in the 8th year of drought, and we have been in a drought emergency, which has been maintained for several years. And I'm pleased to show the 3-month look ahead of precipitation. It's the first time in quite a long time that we've seen something like this, where the state is showing chances of above normal precipitation for the next 3 months. So we'll keep our fingers crossed, but we also continue to plan for continued drought conditions because we know that these forecasts can change. This is our demand status. So for the month of November, we had 22% conservation, which brings our 12-month running averages to 28%. I will say as we get into winter months, it's we have less discretionary water use. People aren't watering as much outside, so percentage-wise, it's harder to achieve the target than it is in the summertime. But I think what's happening is we're seeing the effect of our new production meters that went in last spring, so that has brought our conservation numbers down. Right now we're at 28%. The target is 30%, and a lot can change over the winter with rainfall. So by next spring, we will be coming back with some recommendations on what to do regarding the conservation target. We do want to verify and do some checking on the numbers with the new meters and make sure that everything is looking accurate before we make any recommendations, but that's something we're diligently looking into over the next few months.
I have just a question about this figure compared to the figure 2A in our report.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I don't understand, like when it says system demand acre feet per month, and then this says City of Santa Barbara water demand, but they don't really match.
The difference is this is a monthly chart, so it's showing demands by month. And then the chart you're looking at in the report is total annual demands. So it's tracking the 12-month. It'd be the sum of these would be one data point on the chart you're looking at.
So can I just, maybe you don't have to answer this now, but at some point I'm interested in the demand appears to be going up.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at this monthly, the demand appears to be trending down, and that's something I just have a constant question about. That
Sure. So
address.
the reason is you're seeing on a seasonal basis, the demands will go down in the winter months. People tend to irrigate less in the winter and more in the summer. The annual chart that you're looking at is that our total annual demands over the last 12 months has an uptick. And the reason, one of the reasons, and we're looking into this, but we believe it's because we replaced those production meters last spring, which has increased the total production on the system. And it's likely, by the way, those meters are replaced around April timeframe. And so the chart you're looking at that showing the uptick, we might see that uptick until April of this year, at which point it might level off, because then you'll have a full year of data with the new meters. This chart shows our water sales revenue by month, and the reason we show this chart is just to see if we have any issues with revenue, since much of our revenue is dependent on the amount of water that's used. Right now, our revenues are tracking as projected, and our metered sales seem to be tracking as we would expect as well. Gibraltar Reservoir is currently at about 2,700 acre-feet of storage. We continue to have challenging water quality with high turbidity and high TOC, although we have been able to continue diverting water it's at about 4 acre-feet per day, so 135 acre-feet per month. It's actually been better than what we expected. Our supply projections assumed we couldn't use Gibraltar after October, so the fact that we were able to continue diverting through November and December has been a good thing. And it's diverting enough to continue operating our hydroelectric plant, so it is generating electricity. Kachuma's storage is currently 59,000 acre-feet. That's about 31% of capacity. Of that amount, the city's stored supply is 8,436. We do have the largest amount of carryover in Kachuma as compared with the other Kachuma member units, which puts us at risk if the water levels continue to decline, if the drought continues. We're at risk for some significant hits on evaporation. So we'll be working with the other member units in the county and reclamation on our evaporation management plans. In terms of the emergency pump facility, projections are showing that would need to be operational by fall, so a decision would need to be made by COME this spring regarding the notice to proceed. And this chart is just the comparison of Kachuma storage in the last drought, which is the black line. The current drought is the green line. And so Kachuma storage is right at about when we hit this emergency declaration a few years ago. And with the forecasted rainfall, we're hoping that we get one of these storm events that causes some inflows to the lake. That would be sometime in the next 3 months when an event like that could happen. So imported water, our strategy is to continue to maximize our deliveries to Kachuma. That's about 280 acre-feet per month for the city. That water, it has been just passed through Kachuma, and so we currently have none of it stored at Kachuma. We have about 680 acre-feet left in San Luis Reservoir from the water that was made available in calendar year 2018. In addition, we received our initial allocation from the State Department of Water Resources. It was a 10% allocation, so that's 330 acre-feet to the city. Fairly low allocation, so we'll hopefully there's some storms up north that would increase that in the coming months. With that low 10% allocation, we are continuing to pursue supplemental water purchases. We would like to continue maximizing the pipe capacity Kachuma and bringing in the water. So we've been looking at up to 2,800 acre feet of additional purchases. There is an opportunity with Mojave Water Agency. It's the same deal that we had last year, which has been, it's a fairly good deal compared with others that we've seen in the past. It's $320 per acre foot purchase price. It is a 4-to-1 exchange, so for every 4 acre feet that we receive, we'd have to give 1 acre foot back over a 10-year period. And when we give it back to them, we have to pay the transportation costs, which is about 250 acre feet. And this would be to maintain deliveries, I think this should say through spring of 2020 for 1 more year. We did sign a letter of intent to purchase the water, but it is non-binding. So if conditions change this spring and we don't need to purchase all of that water, we can still back out. Our water debt is currently 3,700 acre feet. If we do this Mojave Water Agency purchase, it would be an additional 700 acre feet of water debt.
When you say maintain the maximum delivery, that's our pie slice of the pipe?
Correct.
Right? And remind me, we have to do that or else we potentially give up that pie slice, right? Or some of it?
If we don't use our portion of the pipe capacity, it would be available to others for their use.
Okay. And then we wouldn't get it back until they were willing to give up, right?
It's actually, we have rights to that proportional share. So it's only in the event that we don't use it that someone else can. If we decide we want to use our proportional share, we have first dibs, first rights to it.
Thanks.
So groundwater, we continue to monitor for seawater intrusion and water levels. We just have our annual surface water and groundwater monitoring agreement that you saw today that will be going to council. And we have been resting our basins for the winter period, although we continue to exercise them regularly in case they need to be brought back online. We're also planning some rehab on some of our wells in order to maximize the production capacity, the rates that they produce water. And if drought continues, we'll plan to bring about 4 wells online this spring. So we'll continue to monitor our supply conditions. Desal project continues to operate in full production, and we have been working on the draft term sheet for the water sales agreement with Montecito Water District, and are planning to bring that to council either January or February, which should be coming soon. And recycled water, there's really no change in status here. The plant is online and is currently meeting all of our system demands.
Just a comment. Back dealing with the Montecito water sales. You just recently went to council with a staff report. I found, I check council agendas every week, and I found that really informative. Yes, we're not involved in it, but it was really informative. Just a requested things like that go forward. Those items that we're not quote unquote involved in, not in our turf, but if they're in a link to that to the board, to the commission, just to look at. That report I thought had a lot of information which would have been of interest if you guys didn't see it. It was a pretty detailed report. So anyway, just a comment.
And this is our water supply strategy. No change since the last meeting. Purple is recycled water. Dark blue is Kachuma water. We're currently in year 8. And so this year we're planning on using more of our Kachuma water that was stored up as carryover from previous years. This is based on the 20% allocation that we received in October. And then Gibraltar is the light blue. Groundwater is the yellow. State water is orange, and then desal is the dark green. So we have sufficient supplies for the next couple of years. There is a small gap out 3 years from now, and we'll have to wait to see what happens with the precipitation this spring, and come back this spring on how to address this shortfall. 2018 Water Supply Management Report. So the purpose of this report, it is backwards looking. It summarizes our water supplies last water year, 2018. It is a requirement of our State Water Project EIR that we make findings that our groundwater basins are in long-term balance. So this shows our water supply mix, what was planned at the beginning of the water year versus what actually happened. Overall, a lot of the supplies were tracking as planned. The big difference you see here is that instead of using Kachuma water, the blue, we ended up just passing through and using all of our state water, which was the orange, which means that we had more Kachuma carryover built up in Kachuma right now, and we have no state water stored in Kachuma. So that's the reason. But overall, things, I think, tracked as planned. Groundwater. So with the city's management of our groundwater supplies, we conjunctively use it and do what's called in lieu recharge. So what that means is that when we have other supplies available, like our surface waters reservoirs are full, we don't really pump from our basins, and we allow natural recharge to build them up. We really only use our groundwater basins during droughts and emergencies. And so this is a chart of our groundwater basins. You can see our storage unit 1 covers largely the downtown area, and we have several wells in that basin. Most of them are connected to the Ortega groundwater treatment plant. We have one well, the Alameda well, that is not, and that one is, we have a pipeline in design right now to connect that well for treatment as well. Foothill Basin is up here. We have 3 wells in the Foothill Basin. And then we have storage unit 3, which is not used for potable use, but it has some non-potable. We have 1 well in that basin for non-potable use. So Foothill Basin is a shared basin. There are several other pumpers in that basin that, and the multi-year drought yield assumes 8,130 acre feet would be available to the city over a 10-year period. Last year, we did not produce any water from that basin because we had surface water available. We ended up resting it. The remaining yield is estimated to be about 3,800 acre feet in storage. The water levels are near 1992 levels. We have about 60 monitoring wells between Foothill and Storage Unit 1. So we've just selected a few for examples to show in a chart the water levels over time. This was the red is the city's pumping. The green down here is pumping by others. So this is the last drought, the amount of pumping that happened in Foothill. And you can see what happened with the water levels. And then after the drought ended, we didn't really pump much at all, and the water levels went back up. Then we started having some water quality issues. This was before we had built the ozone treatment at Cater, so we needed our wells for blending for water quality purposes. And then we got hit with the drought. So we've had quite a bit of pumping over this period, and water levels are now down back where they were 1992 levels. And it will probably take some time to replenish that basin. Although there is, even 1992 isn't the lowest the basin ever was. Back in the 1950s, Foothill Basin was actually lower. So that's how we know we have some remaining yields left in that basin. Storage Unit 1 is an assumed yield of about 16,000 acre feet over a 10-year period. That basin, the city's the only known substantial pumper in that basin. So we're not aware of anyone else who has large production wells in the downtown area. Last year we produced about 450 acre feet, and the remaining yield is about 10,500 acre feet. We do monitor this basin for seawater intrusion. Our Alameda and high school wells are the farthest inland here, so to the extent we can pump those, it minimizes the amount of seawater intrusion that would occur. Here's a chart of our water levels in Storage Unit 1 going back to the last drought, which is the red. The red is the pumping that occurred, and then these lines up here are the water levels. And then after the last drought, we stopped pumping for quite a while, and here we've been pumping. And the water levels in Storage Unit 1 respond very quickly to pumping. That's because that basin is under pressure. It's a confined basin, so you'll see it's very responsive, and even when we stop pumping, the water levels bounce right back up. The bigger concern is seawater intrusion in Storage Unit 1. So here's a map of some of our seawater intrusion monitoring wells, and I've selected just a few for example. The first ones are right near the coast, right here. And you can see this is, it's a little hard to read, but this is chloride concentrations, and it goes back all the way to after the last drought. And so we have seen an increase in chlorides right near the coast, which is an indicator that seawater intrusion is happening right near the coast. This is a little farther inland, about halfway between the coast and 101. Here's chloride concentrations from the last drought, which after we stopped pumping, you can see eventually the seawater subsided and chloride concentrations went away just in time for us to go into the next drought. And we've seen an uptick in chlorides, so there is some seawater intrusion happening this far inland. Next one is the 101, and this is really this is our point where if we start to see chloride concentrations at this location, we would be shutting down our wells because we don't really want chlorides to go in any further. That's sort of our buffer area. That's what we consider the acceptable level of seawater intrusion. So we're still fine at that location. We haven't seen any chlorides. Storage unit. Mm-hmm.
So back a ways, that 10,000 acre foot of projected available water there, is that before you would have intrusion, or just with the amount that's there available?
So that is based on our most recent USGS study, which assumed a 10-year drought, and it assumed we would allow seawater intrusion up to the 101.
Okay. And so there's more water there, but in excess of that would allow it past 101.
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Storage Unit 3, as mentioned, is a little more challenging water quality, so we really only use it for non-potable use. We'd have to put in a treatment plant out there, and the yield is pretty small. The safe yield to the city is about 200 acre feet per year. Last year, we produced about 26 acre feet, which went into the recycled water system, and it's really just only used when the plant is down for maintenance or repairs. So timing, next steps, after this meeting, we will be posting our annual water supply management report, which I'm here to receive feedback on today. We'll be posting it for public access, and then going to council January 29th is the current tentative date. So if you have any comments on the report, I certainly welcome them today. You can also review and read the report. We're accepting comments all the way up through January, so you can send them to myself, and we'll make sure they get incorporated.
Comments, questions? I'll just make my usual comment on my dislike of that red bar at the top of the water source chart to still give the impression that we'll ever go back to 14,000 acre feet a year or something. In fact, you had a slide in there. There was another one that had just two bars with the large red on top of it about the conservation. I'm just going, I just don't think the norm is all that conservation anymore. I think the norm is that with no conservation, and that's our new starting point. And I hope someday we get past that chart. So,
Mr. Chair, only comment I had is I've been reading a lot lately about the concept of a mega drought lasting, much longer than 10 years, into 100 years for the Southwest. And as we get into our long-term water supply plan, I start to see us borrowing water and continuing to borrow water, but it will be an interesting gymnastic exercise when we get to the long-term water supply plan to look at a scenario for essentially the new norm, a mega drought, which is essentially where we're at. Picking up on your thing, we're never going back. We're never going back. And if you take out that bar for purchased water, right, we're going to have to make that up in desal, and it's going to be a good exercise.
That's a good point. And I think in our next long-term water supply plan, we're wanting to look at the effects of climate change on our supplies. There's a lot of models out there that might show quantitatively what happens. And I think Commissioner Keller has been working with his students. We might see something that out of their studies as well. But it's, if we don't know if this is going to be 7 years, 10 years, and Colorado River's been on a 20-year drought cycle. So we can use the models that model climate change impacts to come up with some kind of quantitative estimate of how it will affect our supplies. But then the question is how much do we want to trust the models, or do we want to use some other assumptions or scenarios to kind of take a more conservative approach?
Yeah, I was going to say, I wanted to mimic the old Dr. Keller, Barry Keller, who would always bring up the mega drought, the geologic mega droughts. And so, again, when we get to the long-term water supply plan, looking at those models is going to be very interesting. Thank you.
okay.
I just want to add to that, too. I like that you've changed calling it extraordinary conservation and leaving that white bar in there. I think it's helpful to see that, because we can see that with our continued extraordinary conservation that we're even able to make it at all. And I think that's important messaging. If we take that down to new normal without leaving that white bar in there labeled extraordinary conservation, I think people think, oh, our water supply is taken care of. So I like that the white bar stays in there and that it's labeled that way. And I just really have to commend you for always balancing this water supply strategy in such incredible times. And I think when we start looking at longer term, again, strategies, we can look at our last 8 to 10 years to make our plan for the next 8 to 10 years. And even without relying on models or other things that might be controversial, we can just look at our own history here, shows that we can't expect to get more than that. And then I have a question about some of those things like the Mojave water exchanges or things like that. What if we don't have one to give back later for every 4 that we're getting now, which is
We borrow it again.
which we'll have to look at long term. But for this right now, I think is excellent and makes the points. And I would like to keep that bar in there showing extraordinary conservation.
Okay, thanks. Does anybody have a subcommittee report that's necessary?
We need a recommendation.
Oh.
I guess that council.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Move to approve the recommendation.
Second.
And all those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, there you
Thank
go. Subcommittee reports.
Sea Level Rise Committee did meet a week ago, and Joshua was our lead speaker, who came and talked about the impacts of sea level rise in 2060 and 2100 on El Estero and the wastewater system in the area. And it was, for me, even eye-opening that the distribution system in the city basically takes a major portion of Outer State Street down Las Positas Valley through the Mesa down essentially Cabrillo Boulevard, and that entire area will be compromised by sea level rise. And the implications there are re-engineering, protecting adaptation of that particular system is going to be more than difficult, more than expensive, and we're going to have to take its own, if you will, technical study to address in that regard. While that's interesting from us specifically to our commission, the subcommittee will be receiving a draft adaptation plan at its January meeting, which is really where the rubber's going to hit the road on the big picture. I don't know how much it will go into detail. I don't expect it to go into detail on our facilities, but the overall adaptation plan, again, will be addressed in January into early February. So that's really, like I say, rubber hits the road. We'll have a lot of discussion at that point. Looking at the vulnerability study is pretty basic, but what do you do about that is they're really going to be tough. So anyway, stay tuned.
Yeah. Any others?
I guess just on a related note, you had meant in a previous meeting you had asked about whether the seawater rise would affect our groundwater basins at all, and I did put that question out to USGS. I haven't heard back, but I will keep checking in with them on what their opinion might be on how it might affect the results of their modeling and what our expected seawater intrusion might be.
Yeah, we actually raised that question at the subcommittee. Our consultant did indicate that essentially the answer they're getting in other communities is that yes, it will push seawater intrusion into the higher elevation zone.
Okay, thanks. Water Resources Manager's report. You got like 60 seconds?
I can make it super quick. So I think the points I wanted to hit out, we are right now standing with 6 sewer spills this year. Our goal was to no more than 8. So we are anxiously watching that. That would be a significant milestone for us, certainly related to the consent decree. Another year under our belt where we have meet our goal. The other one is, and I believe I sent an email on this, is the retirement of our wastewater manager. And so we'll be glad we have Galen Fair filling in as acting. And in the new year, we'll be looking to put out a recruitment and look to find a new wastewater system manager.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Okay, we'll be adjourned and we'll see you for our next meeting on January 17th. Thanks.